Okay, so first of all, just want to apologize for being late. My name is Paul Bocking, and I'm presently a teacher here in Toronto, the Toronto School Board, a member of OSSTF, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, as are a couple other members here in the audience who've also spoken here today. And I'm just coming from a school actually where I was teaching in the West End near Hyde Park, and so that was the reason for my lateness. But thank you for your patience here. I'm going to be speaking today about some research which I have been doing over the past summer as towards my doctoral degree in geography and in the program here with Peter Brogan at York University. And like Peter, my research centers on studying teachers' unions in the context of North America. The particular long range of what I'm looking to do for my dissertation will be focusing on looking at the responses of teachers' unions in Canada, the United States, and Mexico to the imposition of neoliberal education policies, and specifically to look at, first of all, what accounts for the movement of neoliberal policy across borders, specifically try to explain the presence of policy, education policy, which is resembles remarkable policies in other jurisdictions, despite vastly divergent realities in these countries, in these cities. And then secondly, how to account for the very uneven responses, which is something which Peter was speaking about, the very uneven responses between teachers' unions in response to these kinds of reforms. So on the one hand, the response of unions like the Chicago Teachers Union most recently to the offense of their and reforms in the rollout of charter schools and whatnot, versus the much more docile response of unions like the United Federation of Teachers in New York. The specific research which I'm going to be doing today, and so I have this little timeline up here, primarily this is just a certain smattering here of different examples of what I describe as neoliberal education policy which has been rolled out in North America in the three countries. What I'm going to be speaking about today are primarily these last 2 points right here, which have taken place in Mexico over the last 5 years. And this comes from a specific paper I was writing, which is going to fold into a larger research project. And it begins with the rollout of a specific set of policies in 2008 in Mexico called the Alliance for Quality Education, which set about to implement a series of proposals around implementing merit pay for teachers to replace any negotiated salary increases, tying teacher employment and seniority to the results of these standardized testings, which our students took, implementing standardized testing for teachers, giving principals far more arbitrary power to decide the employment of teachers, rolling out privatization of teacher education facilities, and a lot more, which I'll get into in a moment. And then I was speaking about how this initial wave of policy in 2008 was faced very uneven success, in that in many parts of Mexico it was successfully resisted and rolled back by democratic rank-and-file movements of teachers in Mexico, despite the official endorsement of the National Teachers Union, which then led to a subsequent second round where the Mexican government then, under a new president, Enrique Peña Nieto, since December 2012 and up to the present period, has endeavored, this time unfortunately with another degree of success, but it's also facing significant roadblocks and opposition to again implement these very similar policies. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about. And when I have the title of my paper here, Why Do Governments Adopt Neoliberal Education Policies? What I'm looking at here in the really subject of my paper, which I'm going to gloss over somewhat and focus mainly more on the empirical, is I kind of a body of theory, I guess, on policy movement in terms of what is the relative weight or balance between, on the one hand, transnational actors like the World Bank or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development for influencing policy because of their roles as experts that, with their legitimacy as being able to generate the most authoritative education statistics, are able to come in and give these policy briefs to governments and therefore gain their adherence, versus the relative weight of business lobby groups that see opportunities for themselves to have investment opportunities, textbook publishers, standardized test marketers, computer companies, electronics companies, all kinds of firms like this which stand to benefit from the opening up of private and tendering of private contracts, versus more ideologically oriented influence as well, like as Peter described, which could come from more ideologically oriented think tanks, which perhaps share interests with the business groups, and their partners in government and from political parties. So that's basically the focus of my research. So what I'm first going to do is speak about I'm going to give a basic overview of a timeline of key events which occurred here, which I think provide a very interesting little study in terms of how these different factors have interacted with each other. And then I'm going to go and look into more detail the individual roles of each of these actors I've described. So the roles of these transnational agencies, the roles of business interest groups, the roles of political parties and coalition of political parties, and also I should add there, which I missed mentioning too, the role of the union as well, which in the case of Mexico has been especially interesting because on the one hand, the National Teachers Union itself, the national leadership has been wholly endorsing, as I explained here, the round of these reforms and policies, but you have a fervent opposition from a movement current within the union. So you have the National Union of Education Workers in Mexico, the SCNTE, to which all teachers, members, and all education workers belong. The leadership there, led by Elvis de Gordillo, since 1989, the self-appointed moral leader for life of the union, backing the initial role of these policies along with the previous president, Felipe Calderon, to implement these policies. Which then faced fervent opposition from the National Coordinating Committee of Education Workers, the CNTE, which I'll also be referring to as the Democratic Teachers Movement. So, as is described here, essentially, the first round of these policies in 2008 meets significant opposition from teachers in many states across Mexico, primarily from states in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, and Michoacan, where the teachers movement, the Democratic teachers movement, has its base, to the extent that the teachers movement controls the state locals in those areas. And so in those states, plus others like Morelos, they are able to effectively push back the national scale implementation of these policies around merit pay and standardized testing and the privatization of teacher training facilities, amongst others, and basically come to agreements, understandings with the state governments, which essentially in many ways circumvented the stated national policy, which was implemented to a lesser extent in other parts, especially in northern Mexico, where resistance was not as strong. Okay. July 1st, Enrique Peña Nieto, leader of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, was elected president. And this is significant because this event marked the return to power of the PRI, which had previously been out of power for the previous 12 years in 2012, when the National Action Party, the PAN, conservative business Catholic party, was in power. But the PRI had previously, prior to 2000, been in power for over 71 years in Mexico, and it controlled politics in Mexico and dominated Mexico during that time, and it was during that time which the PRI had shaped the formation in many ways of the National Teachers Union and helped form it into a highly centralized top-down body, which in the form of its national executive it still is today. So when he was elected in July 2012, in September he was affirmed as a president-elect, and at the same time a number of events happened very quickly in this month. So he initially very quickly began publicizing as one of his key priorities their education reform. At the same time, the OECD publishes a document there, Getting It Right, led by the leader of OECD, Jose Gurria. At the same time, Mexicanos Primero, a business lobby group very similar to Students First in the United States, led by Michelle Rhee and others, basically publishes their wish list for what they hope the new president will accomplish. The leader of Mexicanos Primero is then named to lead Peña Nieto's transition team, and we see many of his recommendations around strengthening the implementation of merit pay, strengthening the role of teacher testing, and the role of standardized testing, the role of parents in fundraising to raise money for the school in place for state funding. We see all those things intensified and put into Peña Nieto's policies. We then see him taking office. We see the amendments roll through the legislature because of prior agreements reached with the other two major parties, the PAN and the center-left Party of the Democratic Revolution, the PRD. And so they roll through for in 2 weeks' time. Shortly afterwards, in an interesting move, we see the leader of the longtime leader, Elvis Gordillo, arrested on embezzlement charges. And many have speculated that this was done to create a popular legitimacy behind these reforms because she was so widely detested by the broader public. But many have also argued that this, in fact, has backfired on Peña Nieto because when she was, with her departure, coincided with a massive wave which has continued to the present period of the democratic teachers movement that without her and her apparatus in power has been much more successful and able to organize outside their strongholds throughout most of Mexico. And so through the spring and the summer of the previous year, they began organizing meetings which were very concerned about the implementation of these policies. Whoa, how to get over here? Sorry. Wrong button. Okay, sorry. Okay, so briefly to state what happened, the significance of the legislation put forward by Peña Nieto and how he was able to get further initially than his predecessor was that he took the basic policies which were put in the Alliance for Quality Education and through the trilateral agreement of all parties was able to essentially amend the Mexican Constitution's education statutes to put in the Mexican Constitution itself that teachers would, as a condition of employment, be subject to established evaluation policies, which would then be further defined through a different set of legislation, which was then passed this past September, enacted this past September. And the reason behind this, the strategy behind this essentially, would be that it would be much more difficult for the democratic teachers movement, which was more regionally focused in certain areas of the country, to be able to reach agreements with state governments if those state governments, by reaching those agreements, would be violating the national constitution. So that's essentially the strategy here. However, the teachers movement, with the departure of Gordillo, was able to dramatically scale up its level of organizing across the entire country. And as it says here, in August and September, was able to organize everything ranging from partial strikes, demonstrations, civil disobedience, to full-out strikes in the vast majority of the country. And at the same time, while they were negotiating with the Interior Ministry at the national level and not being significant success, they were then negotiating more seriously at the state level, leading to tentative agreements with governors and many of their old strongholds, plus a couple more states like Veracruz, and it's still quite murky, but the understanding is that these governors would implicitly not implement these policies despite their implementation in their constitution. So I'm running out of time here, but to very briefly speak about a little bit more detail about these proponents and why I think they're interesting. We have here Mexicanos Primero, a business association, which their role in trying to build legitimacy for there being a crisis, establishing in the public mind that there is a crisis in education, requiring these neoliberal reforms. They're very significant. They released a film called Barely Passing in 2011, which was highly resemblant to Waiting for Superman, and that is a documentary film basically where all the problems in Mexico's education system, which are considerable, were placed at the feet of lazy teachers and their enabling union. And fortunately enough, through different connections, on the board of directors of Mexicanos Primero happens to sit people that own the chief cinema chains in Mexico, so the film was given a wide release throughout Mexico. We have the OECD, who is particularly significant in this circumstance because Secretary General Jose Gurria, as I'll flash to here in a moment, here was previously the Secretary of Finance and Foreign Affairs under previous government in Mexico. So he's from the same party as Enrique Peña Nieto. He had previously been nominated under Vicente Fox, but had not been actively really working with the Mexican government until Peña Nieto, because of the close the relationship prior to Peña Nieto entering power while he was still governor of Mexico State. So Gloria comes in as kind of this third-party legitimator of Peña Nieto's agenda by consistently entering to debates in Mexican media through the release of documents like Getting It Right. But briefly back here, Mexicanos Primero, led by Claudio Gonzalez Fajardo, who's also director of Business People for Technology and Education, which is a lobby group with Ford, Toshiba, Intel, HP, and so on. So we can see some corporate linkages there. His father, I'm sure he's his own person, but just not coincidental that his father happens to be one of the wealthiest men in Mexico and chaired the Mexican Business Council and and various conglomerates. The Pact for Mexico, just to briefly explain in my briefing time why it's significant, was that and why Peña Nieto has actually been able to accomplish so much in his neoliberal agenda than his predecessors has been, was Peña Nieto's success in hammering together this agreement, partially based on the weakness of his other parties to the right in the case of the PAN and to the left of the PRI in the case of the PRD, that he was able to get their support and passing such as legislation where previous neoliberal reforms by the two previous PAN governments had largely been defeated because of the deadlock in the Congress. So Peña Nieto was able to hold together this Pact for Mexico for about a year until it broke down over the opening of the liberalization of the energy industry early this fall. And finally, the National Union of Education Workers, Elba Gordillo, president for life, now in jail, and the Democratic Teachers Movement has significantly gained strength in this time and emerged as a serious force which is trying to organize at the national scale and break out of the regional strongholds they've had since they emerged since 1979. Thank you for my world presentation.